Great, thanks for settling so quickly. My name is Steph. I'm the Head of Communications and the lead for vulnerability at the Green Climate Fund. It's a pleasure and a privilege to welcome you today. I hope we're going to have a highly fun session, a session that hopefully challenges how we think about different parts of the world, and particularly how we finance for climate action in different parts of the world. There will be plenty of time for you to interact with the people here you see on stage and ask questions. And in fact, we will throw some questions out to you as well. Often the expertise is actually in the audience, and then you have some people following some scripts on the stage. So we're very happy to hear, from you as well. Let me quickly introduce our panel. We do have a panel slide, but I think actually we could play the game of matching. Oh no, I don't want to do that. One back. In fact, we could play a game of matching who's who. We worked long and hard to get a male for the panel, so thanks, Andrew. If I can just ask panel members to quickly introduce yourselves, names and organisation. You should all be on.
Andrew Harper, I'm the Special Advisor to the High Commissioner for Refugees. Yeah, that's it, isn't it? Special Advisor on Climate Action, and I'm happy to be the token male.
Excellent. Play the role well, thank you.
Hi everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Patsy Moraman. I'm from South North, and I'm a program lead, leading a program on operationalizing just transitions in Africa, as well as working on various climate finance related projects and programs within SSN. Thank you.
Hello everybody, my name is Namita Vikas. I am the founder and managing director of Optus ESG. It's an advisory firm where we work with financial institutions on developing sustainable finance and climate transition models, frameworks, and capital raising. I'm an ex-banker, so done work in terms of lending, handled a portfolio of about $1 billion in sustainable finance. Thank you.
Wonderful. There is a formal title for today, but to get straight to the heart of the matter, we're going to spend the next hour talking about what does it take, is it possible, should we be climate financing fragile and conflict-affected states. I've spent the last 15, 16 years living in Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Palestine, Syria, a few of the world's most interesting places, and I wanted to share a story from my first day in Mogadishu. I was invited to have breakfast with the president, and I was greeted at the entrance to Villa Somalia. You have to picture a very hot, sunny day, the sun glinting off the buildings, lots of street dogs around. In fact, I was more worried about street dogs than I was worried about Shabab. And I was walked down through the compound, the Villa Somalia compound, towards the president's house. And right from the very first gate, I noticed a little old lady following me, and she had a chicken under each arm. And as we progressed down through Villa Somalia, the security got more tight and more tight, and she kept following. She was also advanced through each of the security checks, and I began to get very worried that I was being very rude to perhaps the president's mother or the president's sister, so I kept turning around and doing a very awkward grin and ushering the woman, but she stayed steadfastly behind me with her chickens. As we got down to the very final gate, and the president's house was just there, and the really elite bodyguards were there. They ushered her through before they ushered me through. In fact, they said, wait, and I was convinced I had then done something terribly wrong and offended the president's mother. She was in there for about half an hour, and then I was shown in. I had a wonderful breakfast with the president. A big tray of just cooked liver, camel liver, was put on the table. He noticed my face and very kindly ordered porridge for me, which has remained a standing joke between us. As I left, I spoke to the guards on the gate and said, who was the woman? Was that the president's mother or aunt or sister? And they said, no. That was just some old woman from the village. And yesterday she had 5 chickens, and her neighbour stole 3. And so all she has left now are the 2 chickens that she was carrying. And she came to ask the president to get her chickens back. And then they saw the look flash across my face, and they must have thought it meant something entirely other. Because no, he will do it, Steph. He will find the chickens. And I felt so enormously humbled in that moment because I was being paid by the US State Department to turn up in Somalia and help build a state along democratic lines and all those very obvious state building things that we do, a constitution, federalisation, elections. But in fact, I was welcomed immediately into this extraordinary world of inclusion where as a citizen you could talk to your president, ask him for something and trust that he would do it for you. And it really framed my whole perspective on what it means to state build in a country like Somalia, which is less about looking at those structures that we invent and embed, but recognising what the principles are that already exist and how do we match what we need to do with the principles that are on the ground. So I'm deeply attracted to working in these kinds of places, deeply attracted to learning about them, and that's what we want to do today. Who here identifies as being from a country that's been classified as fragile and conflict affected? Who's ever worked or lived in one? What are some of the countries that you've lived and worked in? Yeah, just shout it out.
Syria, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Palestine.
The circuit. Oh, that's wonderful. So please, you feel free to pipe up and offer your expertise. I want to start with doing some imagining, actually, today. I want us to imagine that we're in a big cosmopolitan city where every year thousands of people come from around the world to meet, debate, write resolutions and pacts and talk about all the ways in which the world needs fixing. I know it's hard to picture this big cosmopolitan city in which this takes place, but give it a go. And now take it one step further. Imagine you're at a very big donor conference in this particular city, and you are, in fact, the donors. You're the representatives of governments, of the private sector, of civil society organisations, of philanthropies, who are wondering what role you have to play in a country I'm going to call Country X. And what we've done today is assembled a panel of experts whose job it is to convince you that it's a great idea, actually, to give your money, particularly your public money, to Country X. And at the end of today, I'm going to ask you if you're convinced, or if you think there are actually other things that we need to know or could do better. Let me tell you a little bit about the organisations that we have here, and then I'm going to read you a little bit of a case study. So, of course, you heard Andrew say that he's from the UN. It's a big, multilateral UNHCR. Yeah, when you roll into town, the machinery rolls into town. We have FATSIMO from community-led organisation and very much working in locally led action in the coalface with communities. And we have Namita representing the private sector. We did also have a regional representative and a government representative, but their planes crashed, so they didn't make it to the donor conference. Let me put up something on the screen now. This is region Y, in which we find Country X. We spared no expense in coming up with names of countries. Country X is a particularly vulnerable country to the impacts of climate change. A large arable area of the country is increasingly impacted by desertification. Unpredictable rainfall patterns combined with deforestation, environmental degradation. This has created a series of interlinked ongoing crises throughout the region. It suffers from food insecurity. Country X now imports 50% of its food consumption, up from 30% 15 years ago. Some local efforts led by regional governments and civil society have encouraged increased agricultural resilience, but large-scale adaptation projects haven't yet been initiated. There's a high degree of pastoral agricultural conflict. Disrupted access to land, equitable resources distribution has led to increasing violence between these two communities. And this conflict is causing challenges for anyone to collect data or to actually understand what's happening on the ground. No one, in fact, has been able to access isolated parts of this country for several years. Displacement is at work. The most at-risk municipalities in the region have seen 25% of their population displaced. There's high government debt. Coupled with fluctuating global oil and energy prices, the government's been put at significant risk of debt distress. It's therefore increasingly reliant on concessional finance to make any kind of resilient investment. Does it sound familiar? It's not a country, but a composite mix of many of the countries that many of us have lived and worked in. Just to be really sure we know what we're talking about, is there a way of holding that slide on the screen without it going back? I asked AI to do some thinking for us. AI, right at the moment, is only as good as our brains and ideas are. It learns from us. So this image is actually a composite of what it has picked up from what we think and how we visually depict countries or regions like I've just described. And I think this image, as bleak as it is really not very far off what is in every donor government's mind when they hear fragility and conflict. That's half the battle, dealing with this perception, this mythology that it's too big, too hard, too risky. So, how do we navigate complexities of climate financing in a landscape like this? And I put it to you, it may not be quite as challenging as we might think. I find in a lot of these conversations we spend a lot of time talking about challenges. I actually want to move us into things that work and solutions. But the first question I'm going to ask the panel members is, very, very quickly, thinking from your particular hat and your lens as an organisation, what are one or two of the critical challenges that you face in this scenario? Namita.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. I think, so two challenges I want to put out. The first one is underfunding and limited access to climate finance. So essentially, fragile states, conflict-affected states, they receive significantly less amount of funding in comparison to other states, and that's on account of, one, because of the high levels of financial risks that are there, potential disruption to the management processes, so projects getting disrupted altogether. I think two, because at one level, climate-related strategies are not well integrated, or in the context of fragility or in the context of conflict, they are not really embedded within those larger strategies. And I think the third part is that there is a precedence that is set to channelize capital first towards response, economic stabilization. How do you put together the core functions of the state? And therefore, climate, governance, these issues really take the back seat. That's the first point. The second challenge I see is risk aversion of climate funders. Climate funders, as a banker, I can tell you, the comfort is to just go with what is a set risk matrix, an ROI that is set, which gives the potential lender the comfort to channelize capital in that direction, right? And especially in vulnerable communities, it's deemed very risky to channelize capital in those areas. And if you look at the case study, the road project, despite the MDB supporting the road project, it has been jeopardized purely because of the disruptions that have happened at the ground level. So I see these two from a private lens, the biggest challenges to come about.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Yeah, not to repeat what Namita has said, we have some similar points, but I think what's important to note is that the context in which this specific case study presents is that it's within a context where there's rising government debt, which is significantly kind of limiting the options that the government has to support access to unlock the finance. Never mind delivering the finance in terms of implementation, but actually unlocking the finance is already severely constrained by the high levels of government debt. And then this is coupled with limited fiscal capacity to address competing priorities that are associated with the escalating, food insecurity, the socioeconomic impacts as well that are stemming from the conflict. And then alongside the rising risk perceptions of domestic financial institutions. So already they're on a back footing in terms of unlocking finance, never mind delivering it. So I think the big challenges are around, that kind of framing and within that context. And so in instances where finance, which a lot of finance is through non-concessional bilateral loans, it means that conflict states like, country X, cannot actually meet the requirements to unlock the finance. And then secondly, as Namita mentioned, there's the risk aversion. So climate finance, like most finance, is risk averse. And so you have bilateral and maybe development agencies that are not willing, or they're very much reluctant to even implement any projects in regions like Region Y, because of the high security risks, the additional costs, the capacity gaps, and also the risk of even aggravated conflict and changing conflict dynamics. And then lastly, around the institutional and governance frameworks within these states, that's also a challenge because now, obviously climate finance is typically channeled through the state. And then so these state institutions actually are often unable to reach the most vulnerable populations where the finance is actually needed the most. And so that creates a critical challenge to getting, improving resilience and supporting these communities to, in their efforts.
Thank you. Andrew.
I'll just throw it back to the old lady with the chickens and say, okay, what impact can you do? And if you're the Green Climate Fund or what are you actually, how can you make sure that her chickens are going to be protected in the future, given the heat, given the growing insecurity? Will she continue to have access? Why does she have to go to the president? Is that because there's no other institution which is in place? So there's different levels. It's not just all about climate. It's about the integrity of the institutions which are governing. So it's the issue of governance. But when you start getting down to the populations, which is what's key, it's sort of like giving money to a capital does not ensure that there's resilience or adaptation for these communities. So you have to talk to the people, and you have to talk to the women who are sort of going to be so intrinsic to holding the communities together. Because if you lose that empowered positioning, then you lose the society. So there's a lot of people sort of say, okay, accessibility, affordability, availability. It's all context specific and ranges at different levels. So how do you ensure that those people who are going to be most impacted by climate change are included? So you've got to have a whole of society approach, and you have to make sure that it's affordable. So not outlandishly, like we know about the interest rates and conditions that the fragile states have to pay. We're basically throwing them into certain collapse if we keep doing that. The availability, does it get down to the people who's required? Like you mentioned the presidents in Mogadishu, what about in those areas which are controlled by Al-Shabaab or Boko Haram? What about situations like Mali or Niger? Like, we can't just be looking at the accessible places. We have to be looking at the hard-to-reach places. I'm not saying that money should be provided without sort of accountability, but that's where we've got to look for the innovative ways of financing.
Thank you. So donors, remember you're all donors sitting there. Any challenges we've missed? Yes.
My name is Antoine, and I came from Senegal, Dakar. I was wondering.
Thanks, Andrew.
I've got 2 jobs.
Yeah.
We are trying to figure out the problem here when it's happened. It's already there. But did we look at ex ante? Why is it a country is becoming fragile? And it's not always, and rarely, that is a problem of climate change. It's because something have been brewing in the country for a long time. Climate change is like 20 years ago, 25 years ago. This country have been in trouble very long time ago. We cannot solve the climate situation if we don't solve those congregations.
Yes.
And it's morally is going to happen because where I came from, Senegal is the only country that is still standing up. If you go to Burkina, Mali, Niger, they are all in trouble. So no one is going to come and say it's because of climate change. This is something that we have to solve before we go to the climate change.
Antoine, thank you very much, and thanks, Andrew, for being the gopher as well. Any other comments from donors in the audience? Oh, excellent. I was hoping it was going to be in the last row.
I wasn't token male.
Actually, I think Karen's found it. And And sorry, tech people, I know I didn't ask for a floor mic, so you put my face on a dartboard afterwards, but thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, playing my part of the donor. Hi, my name is Megan. I am worried about corruption and state capture and facilitation payments.
Aren't we all? So any other comments, any other challenges that we may have missed? So as a donor, just give me the classic, this very, very accurate scale, the thumb scale. Are you thinking about you might be coming up with a big pledge at the end of this conference? Are you on the fence or are you definitely worried? Give me a thumb scale. Everyone put a thumb up. Where are the believers? Where are the believers? I've one believer over here. Yeah, you put your thumb up, right? Thank you very much. We're coming to you for a checkbook signature at the end of this. Okay, we've quickly covered challenges. Let's move on to how we actually make things work. I was at a very interesting meeting last week here in New York, and one of the guests at the meeting said that we're in danger of innovating our way to extinction, which I found a really interesting statement. In fact, that speaker went on to say, don't give me innovation to fund, just give me boring, but it works. And I felt that was a really interesting lesson. Boring, but it works. And I'm sure there's a lot of collective expertise here around boring, but it works. And also into that innovative, it could work. Namita, I'm going to talk to you because that comment actually came from a member of the private sector. What, in your experience, what resilience investments are likely to be effective in this kind of scenario?
Yeah. I think you've just hit the nail. It's very important to start with avoiding the pitfall, because it's all about how do you do product structuring based on what is the kind of need of that borrower. So I think that context is extremely important. Most of the times, finance is looked at, I have a credit line and I want to deploy that credit line and therefore I need to push it out, literally, right? So how do you balance between the borrower's need and the lender's need is very important. In case of vulnerable states, I think, climate finance shouldn't translate into a debt trap. So you mentioned that the government is already in debt, right? And if I was just looking at a data point here, half of the funding provided to fragile and conflict-affected states came in the form of loans and other debt financing. And 78% of these were classified as medium to high risk of debt stress. So I think it's very important to look at the structuring to start with. And then what's most effective from that angle? I think grant-based funding is the core to begin with. Backed by public sector de-risking kind of mechanisms, bundling public investments, GCF, GEF kind of, patient capital coming to the fore with MEGA kind of guarantees, because you need that facilitation. I think that would bring about the kind of capital flows which could go into long gestation periods, because climate-related investments are not matching the private sector's expectations of short-termism, right? For private sector, it's all about ROI, short-termism, 3 to 5 years max. But we need here, we're talking about capital which is upwards of 10 to 15 years. So how do you look at that angle? I think one of the quick examples that I want to bring here is a MEGA guarantee that was done in Korea for the Korea-Myanmar Industrial Corporation. And this was a $5.7 million US guarantee where MEGA covered a loan by the state, Korea, to a commercial lender for the protection against any kind of climate as well as disruptive kind of incidences. So I think we need PPP, public-private partnership financing models like this coming to the table, where there is a potential to build resilience, create a stable market, and bring mainstream finance for economic growth. Just a couple of last points here. Catastrophe bonds, you may have heard of. There's a good uptake of CAT bonds. About $12.3 billion of issuances in the half of 2024 and 49 transactions. I think these are the kind of instruments which need to be taken more seriously, if I may say that, with the right kind of issuers to the table. And the last point is on regional insurance pools. I think these are very important to provide the participative governments with parametric insurance coverage at affordable costs against the market rate. I think that's important because we need concessionality for these kind of states, right? It's not business as usual. So I think that's something to be looked at. So tailoring coverage against, the different kind of parameters that these borrowers come through, I think that needs to be looked at, and adjusting the premiums accordingly. So I would think these are the best methodology to be used in context of resilience financing.
Yes,
here.
and critically that packaging.
Absolutely.
What are those blended finance tools and how do they fit together? Yes, absolutely. Pasimo, how would your organisation, from a community perspective, listening, we've heard about risk, we've heard about blended finance, we've heard about parametric insurance. How would, as a community organisation, South North, design financial instruments that are adaptable to evolving conditions? Because of course, we know that when we get into fragile and conflict-affected situations, it's not status quo, it is highly unpredictable. A huge degree of flexibility and nimbleness is needed. So how do you actually design those tools that change as things change, and how do you work with communities to do that?
Thanks. I think I'll touch on a point made by the audience members well around kind of how do you deal with corruption, and a large part of that is accountability and holding those that are providing the finance accountable. And a large part of that as well is in making sure that the local communities are involved and are an integral kind of part of the process in identifying the financial instruments that are going to support, and so also in terms of making sure that the finance gets down to that local level, you need to think about obviously the design of that financial instruments, particularly for fragile and conflict-affected states. And from that perspective, I think what should be priority and should prioritize flexibility, community involvement, and resilience. And again, to Antoine's point about the root cause, so you'd start identifying obviously the root cause of the conflict, and ensure that the instruments that these instruments that you develop can be adapted to evolving economic conditions. So in many instances, this means lowering the burdensome requirements and creating flexible operational and implementation protocols and that are adapted to the changing conditions, context and contours of conflict and fragility. So, going down to the local level and really understanding their specific needs, priorities, and challenges within that local context is really critical in designing and thinking about what kind of models that, financial models can support. So working, this will require working quite closely with local stakeholders to identify formal and even in some cases informal financial support that can be effective for that specific community. And again, to your point, Steph, around flexibility, right? You need flexible financing models, and these could include options for deferred payments or variable interest rates or even contingency funds for use in case of emergencies, including, for example, climate emergencies. As we'll hear later, there's a climate emergency that's on the horizon in this case, but not to give it away. Another key consideration in designing these financial instruments for delivering finance in these contexts is capacity building. So you need to enhance local ownership and sustainability of these instruments. And to do that, you need to equip the local communities with the knowledge to manage and utilize these instruments effectively. I think to some of Namita's points as well, the incorporation of risk management tools is also critical. So insurance products or guarantees to protect the investments against potential losses due to the conflict or instability. Quite critically as well is aligning with the local economy. So identifying financial instruments that are suited or tailored to supporting local economic activities that are resilient and sustainable and can address the most pressing needs of that region. In region Y, there's a lot of displacement as a result of the conflict. So how do you identify ways to address that? And then very importantly as well is the monitoring and feedback loops. So the financial instruments or the way you go about identifying these must allow for adaptability based on continuous feedback loops from the community and the stakeholders with which these instruments are meant to serve. And that's critical as well because it builds that local ownership and accountability. Yes. Addressing the key point around corruption, it's about local having accountability at that level, which in the long term would translate into much greater impact.
Thank you. I'll just
Sure.
stop you there so we can keep the conversation moving. We have a grantee at the Green Climate Fund, a private sector grantee in a fragile state, who's taking garbage from the street and turning it into energy. And in fact, it's been so successful that BMW, which has one of its manufacturing plants in that country, will get 100% of its power from this initiative over the course of the next year. And I spoke with him last year at one of our board meetings, and he said one of the issues, GCF is funded by public money. Many of us are funded by public money. There's an extra lens there, or an extra importance to treating our tax dollars properly. But he said that, in fact, when he was putting together his budget for the project, he had allowed $12,500 for the ESG work. It cost him $125,000 in the end, and he just hadn't incorporated that at all. My question is around the necessity of gold standards. And I'm asking you again as a donor community, are you wedded to gold standards or absolute best practice of risk management, of transparency, of accountability? Or would you be inclined to also entertain a fit-for-purpose model? Has anybody had any experience in countries or situations where you've said, well, that would be the gold standard model, but this is what we'll accept? Yeah, let's. Yes. There's a microphone coming.
Thanks, great. I work for an organization called Start Network. We're a membership organization working across six continents, but we focus on giving money to local organizations, and we've come up against this compliance problem over and over and over again. So what we've adopted is a tiered compliance system whereby we give out money based on the amount, the size of the organization, their kind of risk profile, but also the amount of money that they are asking for. So an organization asking for a few million is going to be in a different compliance profile than an organization asking for tens of millions of dollars. And what we do when we find an organization with a lower compliance profile is we help them build up their compliance profile so that if they want to access more and more funding from a variety of different donors and funders, public, private, that we're actually giving them the financial tools and the accountability tools to be able to do that. Because most of the time they're just nascent. They're not corrupt. They're just immature.
Yes. When I first arrived in Mogadishu, the guard at the central bank was blind. And people quite literally just walked in and out of the central bank. As donors, are you prepared to entertain a tiered approach to risk that's commensurate with the ability of the organisation and of the amount of money that you're giving? Would that be something that's acceptable? Yes.
Just to say, we have 6 government donors that have signed up to this.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. Andrew, it seems like there is room and appetite for innovation in this space. What are some options or avenues that you consider haven't been fully tapped yet?
Well, I think the most innovative thing would actually be if people work together.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
In terms of I've been involved in a lot of refugee operations around the world, and every agency that comes to a refugee operation needs to do their own assessment. And it's just like, no, just agree on a common approach, get on with the work, and have a common needs assessment, have a common methodology, make sure it's in alignment with what the government is planning, because like we're talking, like anything to work in a country which is fragile, you have to be working with the government. Like it's obviously important to be working with the community, but it's imperative that you're working to reinforce what the government's seeking to achieve, particularly on climate financing and their goals and the NAPs and whatever. The innovation depends on where you are. If you're talking about innovative financing in Africa, there's nothing which we can probably do to teach Africans on how to do things better, because they adapt. If you like keep going back to Somalia, Somalia had the best, like one of the highest rates in the world in terms of internet connectivity during the worst days, because they valued that. In terms of financing through phones, again, we've got nothing to teach the African population in that regards. It's also having a better understanding. Like we sort of see it's our, well, I don't want to say our responsibility because that's very paternalistic, but there's so much going on that we don't recognise. So like one of the things which I was looking at then was just how much remittances are engaged in Somalia's GDP. 25%.
Yeah.
So maybe an innovative thing is to try and facilitate more remittances into these areas, rather than trying to sort of like do it ourselves. Like from UNHCR's perspective, because we're very obviously focused on people, it's about getting cash in hand, and then trying to reduce the overheads of that, and trying to make sure that that woman who has got those chickens receives cash. We had challenges in the Middle East when we were dealing with the refugee crisis on diversion of aid and making sure that who got it. We introduced biometrics, but it wasn't our biometrics. The governments in the region already had biometrics. So it's context specific. So it's about, you have that global challenges of, like always the competition between global cohesion and context sort of flexibility. And so innovation means understanding the context, respecting what works, and trying to reinforce that rather than coming in with something new.
So just to turn the point back to you then, you started by saying it would be great if we worked together, and you treated that as some form of innovation. What's UNHCR doing in this space to work together? I mean, because donors, all these donors here want to have maximised returns, right?
There's 120 million people in the world at the moment who have been displaced by conflict. And it's basically doubling every 5 to 10 years. Our funding is at 20 to 30%. So is that sustainable? No. Is it likely there's more people going to be displaced by conflict? Yes. There's 10 million people at least displaced by conflict in Sudan. So we've got no choice, which makes sense anyway, that you work with others who are understanding the root causes. So waiting for people to cross a border and using that as your key performance indicator is rubbish. Like, what we have to look at is human security. And so what are we doing? We're working with agencies like the Green Climate Fund. We're working with the bank. We're working with ODI. We're trying to understand what the future challenges to human security will be and bringing the evidence and data to them. So there's no one who's probably more collaborative on this issue than UNHCR, because we know that we don't have the resources and capacity to keep providing that protection and assistance. So looking at food security, we're very much involved with research institutes such as CGIR, Potsdam Institute, Columbia, working with ODI, anyone who can give us a better understanding of the future risks, and then trying to advocate on their behalf. So when we go to, for instance, the Green Climate Fund of the World Bank, we're not advocating for UNHCR for the money. We need that money to go to Senegal. We need that money to go to Somalia or Kenya. And so this is what it's more about bringing people together and having that common outcome. What is it that we want, not just for Somalia, but for the Eastern Horn of Africa?
Yes, yes.
So it's not, we can't just be country specific, because it's going to have an impact across the region. Our friend from Senegal, like, they are worried because they're seeing that whole challenges going from Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Senegal. Like, what's going to be happening in a situation like basically the whole west coast of Africa in the future, and the amount of challenge. Anyway, we'll just go through that. But we've got no choice. It's a global question which we all have to work towards.
So donors, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is really incredibly important and 1 is you couldn't care less, how important is it to you that there is not just lip service paid to collaboration and coherence, but there is actually things like, well, we have a climate assessment done by X organisation. We're just going to take that one, or this organisation has already been accredited to that organisation. We trust that accreditation process. We're going to take them on board. How important to you on a scale of 1 to 10 is expecting the actors here to act with really concrete coherence? And if you're thinking for you it's an 8 or 9 or 10, does someone want to share why that's important? And how would you actually check to see if that's happening? Yes.
My name is Dario Soto. I represent Trafigura Foundation. We're a small philanthropy based in Geneva, $20 million a year. For us as philanthropy, it's quite important because A, is more efficient. We're 6 people, and many of our peer philanthropies are the same. We're based in Geneva, so we don't have boots on the ground. And we do rely heavily on what other philanthropies are doing. So for us, sharing the pipeline, sharing due diligence, crossing references, relying on visits, field visits that others do, and the same, others on ours, is super important. And what we are doing as philanthropy indeed is investing heavily in what we call collective action. So we're paying into the biggest philanthropies, climate works and the like, to actually get movements of pooling funds together, sharing resources, de-risking the big commercial investors, because this is for us one of the biggest problems that we face, that donors are doing the same over and over and over, and the implementers are complaining, you're asking for the same reports,
Yes.
the same due diligence, etc. So top 10 in our priorities.
Anybody else up near the 10s? Yes.
Yeah, we're near the 10s. I work with Acumen. We're an early stage impact investor, and thanks to the Green Climate Fund for a lot of support over the years. And I really think it has to be driven by the donor community, because there is an incentive for organizations to create their own taxonomies and differentiate themselves via value proposition in the space that we think will attract donor dollars. That's real still today. But if the donor organizations got together and said, this is our combined commitment, we will only implement grant capital if you have adopted such, you have the lever and the driver. But organizations still to this day feel like there's a value proposition and a competitive advantage to creating their own at this point. So let's do that because we're ready and waiting, but we need that commitment before we're going to give up some of our competitive advantage to get that capital.
That's a whole model change, right?
Yes,
That's a whole systems change,
shift,
actually. Thank you very much. We mentioned in the case study that this had been a largely rural population, which has, because of displacement due to climate hazards, has moved in a large way into the city. Andrew, UNHCR experiences this issue around refugee populations, internally displaced people. When you're considering movement of people from their traditional places where they've lived and farmed and into urban environments, what are some of the ways that you need to be flexible to make sure that your programs and your access follows them?
Again, it'd be focusing more on working with the communities and the government and making sure that we're fitting with their own programs. But what we are seeing is, we're talking about climate change, but you've got these other mega trends which we have to take into account. Like you've got obviously urbanisation, you're talking about desertification in this context as well. So it's no use looking at the current situation. You have to start looking at what is the likelihood of the population to be moving there within the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, because to invest in infrastructure takes a long time. But one of the challenges here is that if you look at places like the Sahel and a country like Niger, the population is going to double every 17, 18 years. You've got places like Nigeria where I think by 2050, 1 in every 10 births in the world will be in Nigeria. So massive populations growth. So what we have to be looking at is these urban environments will not just double within the next 20 years, they could probably quadruple. And so this has to be sort of like looking not only the infrastructure side, but also the disaster risk reduction side.
Yes.
And so one thing which Colombia's done, which has been really quite cool, is they've had huge numbers of displaced people coming from the rural areas because of the conflict, and they've accepted them, but what they've said is, look, we're not going to put you at more risk. So if you're in an area which is likely to be flooded or suffer landslides, you've got to move. But what I would also say at the outset is you've obviously got all the issues in terms of maintenance and infrastructure, but education. You've got to be investing in education now for these populations that are coming through, because if you don't, then it's got all these other elements in terms of societal collapse, issues with girls' employment, blah, blah, blah. So.
Yes. Passimo, I'm going to ask you, it's a question, it's a surprise question. Have you had experiences with the donor community where something has fundamentally shifted in the landscape or the environment or the context you're working in, and the project proposal you receive funding for is no longer the best fit? Have you found yourself in that position, or how do you work with the donors, whether it's to ensure that there's an understanding that things may need to change?
I wouldn't say there's a specific instance where that's occurred, but I think, again, similar to Andrew, I put it back to the donor. I think it's the donor, the imperative is on the donor to understand that these situations actually do occur, and they need to be flexible enough to be able to adapt their agendas, but also not necessarily the agenda, but just be flexible and understanding to these changing contexts. And also in bringing the funding, kind of the imperative or what's ideal is that they come in with an open mind in terms of what is actually required and listen to the specific needs of that, whatever the situation at hand. And be flexible to creating funds and providing funds that meet those needs and not necessarily their agendas.
And critical to telling that story convincingly is an understanding of what's happening on the ground, what is changing. But in many of the areas that we've lived and worked in particularly, and if we look at country X in region Y, it's really, really difficult to get information from the ground. So how do you manage that from a monitoring evaluation perspective, from keeping an eye on impact? How can governments in this context support the financing of investments on the basis of different ways of measuring change?
Yeah, exactly. I think, and interestingly, access to data and information is one of the critical barriers to unlocking finance in many developing countries, particularly in the global south. And when you then add on a layer of fragility and instability, you can imagine that getting that data becomes even more challenging. At the same time, this data is quite critical to impact and risk assessments that then inform or are essential for attracting investors. So therefore, the role of government in mitigating these associated risks that result from the lack of data, for example, maybe through guarantees, is critical. And so government's role really is that they need to play a much more proactive role in providing initial funding and support implementation at the initial phases as a means to overcome or just get over the initial hurdles and risk perceptions that are even further exacerbated by the lack of data. So that's I think a critical role for government to play, and also in line with what you were alluding to, we need to also redefine how we measure impact. So often the true effects of interventions, and particularly those interventions that are aimed at enhancing resilience, are not easily captured through your usual numerical metrics. And so, there's a need for reevaluating what we consider as data, and being more flexible. Again, the word flexibility comes in, and adopt a more flexible approach to measuring scale and impact. I can.
I might
elaborate,
go back to the audience. And does anybody here have experience with innovative models or ways of extracting information from hard to reach areas or population groups that are not connected? Yes, a hand here in the middle. If you just very briefly share.
Not so innovative, but I think it's relevant in this case because we're talking about also state building. I was involved in a project funded by the Millennium Challenge Corporation some years ago in which we were trying to figure out how to do the M&E. And the ultimate decision was to support the National Statistical Institution and build on the survey that they were already trying to do on a regular basis for this country. Because it was challenging enough to fund that organization and have the capacity, so why fund someone else to come in and do another study? And that was a long-term project, so it actually led to funding for that institution over like a 5-year period, I think, which was quite helpful.
Yeah, exactly. And another call around not reinventing if there's something there. I worked on a project in Somalia. It was humanitarian financing for Somalia, and it was actually the monitoring and evaluation of how that happened. And there were areas, this was way back in 2013, 2014, there were areas of the country no one could get to safely, still controlled by Shabab. But there were mechanisms that cash transfers were getting into the communities, but we couldn't actually really see what or how, or if people, if the full $20 was getting there or 15 or 10. So we set up a call centre and we made phone calls into the community. And we had 10 or 12 Somali phone agents who made those calls and said, you were due to get $20 today from WFP. Did you get it? And if you did, how much of it did you get? And they were measured actually along service delivery times, and they knew that every survey should take about 5 minutes to complete. And you didn't want to be on the phone for more than 5 minutes because no one knew who Shabab was in the community or who was listening into these weird conversations about who was getting cash from which donor. There was one metric that stood out one day when we were reviewing the day's call list that everyone had spent 3 to 5 minutes on a call, but one call was 45 minutes long. And so we spoke to the Somali phone agent, and she said just oh yes, he was a poet. And I've always treasured that story around that we have to allow for the human instinct in these areas as well. Namita, I'm going to come to you before we introduce another event into this. We've talked a lot about flexibility. We've talked about the difficulties of gold standard. We've talked about tiered approaches, what we mean by impact. When you're thinking from a private sector perspective about flexibility in your normal policies or project requirements, what safeguards or processes do you need to have in place that can give the donors confidence that they can fund through you?
Okay. If you look at, first call is to cover for the credit and the liquidity risks, right? And that comes through institutional backing in terms of credit enhancements or guarantees that could be accessed. So I'm just thinking about how do you structure a project like that. But I think in the context that we are talking, the most important is how do you cover for the currency risks or the hedging mechanisms. So I think one of the first safeguards, and I would like to cite an example. We worked with the Zimbabwe government, and this was 3 ministries within the Zimbabwe government: the Finance Ministry, the Environment Ministry, and the Social Development Ministry, along with 3 UN agencies. The objective was to build a gender-responsive clean energy finance facility, particularly for decentralized solar that was being done. And we looked at the first stop to look at putting together very robust foreign exchange risk strategies in place, which looked at currency devaluation stress testing to navigate any kind of volatility, to look at hedging instruments like forward contracts and options, which were bundled as a part of this so that any kind of future transactions are covered for. Then, borrowing in local currency against, getting the loans in foreign currency. So how do you build the currency swaps in that? It's a little technical in that sense, but I'm saying that, tailored financial instruments to look at how do you bring in these kind of aspects to cover different kinds of risks. Crisis modifiers, in fact, where the ability of a product is to quickly shift to responding to a crisis, and the components are all pre-decided. So therefore, there are no lengthy processes that one needs to go through when you look at these aspects, right? But to answer your question, when we built this entire facility and it got derailed because there was no appetite from the Zimbabwe private sector to come forward to provide debt. So we looked at converting that into equity, because equity is a little easier than getting debt. And a similar model was done where then the UN SDG fund gave in $10 million as the initial cover for these kind of risks to be covered, and the facility, and then a private sector Old Mutual Group was walked in to do the financing from an equity lens. What I'm trying to say is these are some of the safeguards. Also, I would say robust monitoring, because private sector would want to do monitoring at a very high scale, right? Because ultimately it's all about ROI.
Isn't your monitoring called profit?
It's for profit, yes, absolutely. So, the whole ring fence around monitoring is very key to also know how we always think in terms of if you have to fail, if you have to exit. So risks are either transferred, they're either mitigated, or they are dealt with in different ways, right? So monitoring is more for looking at what do you do if the risk comes up. If an asset becomes substandard, then monitoring needs to throw up that very quickly for an institution to take a call. So I think these are some of the safeguards that are very important, and to build these kind of very, innovative again, kind of structures where you have a bundle of things put in at the same time. Each instrument plays its role to cover the risk or provide those safeguards.
Thank you very much. We're actually almost at the end of an hour, which has sped past. We were going to introduce a flood event. I had asked for a rain machine to bring an element of reality, but the budget didn't stretch that far. But we don't have time. We don't have time to go there, sadly. I'm going to throw back to the audience in a moment to give us a vote of confidence or otherwise. But just quickly from each of the panel members, any last and really 30 seconds of last moment of wisdom. Who wants to go first? Your last plea.
Okay. I think one point to mention is an important one in developing or identifying, ways to finance in these kind of contexts is to make sure that you also address the combined objectives of peace, security, and humanitarian efforts. I think this is critical. In addition to kind of the climate and development objectives, you need to include those as well. It's a way to ensure that the investments in the climate action is working also towards creating the environment in which these financial instruments can actually be sustainable.
So you're spooking a 3-for-1 deal.
Yeah,
invest in climate, get peace, security,
pouring
resilience.
water into a bucket
Yes.
that doesn't have holes at the bottom.
Absolutely. Thank you. Andrew?
I'll just sort of focus on invest in peace. Like what we're seeing more and more countries around the world go from unstable to fragile to failed. So there's no choice. We have to invest. But that investment means to make sure that the woman who is with her 2 chickens, when we go back and talk to her, she's got 10.
Yes.
So it's not and her children are going to school, and she has got tenure on the land where she is. And it doesn't matter whether she's a national or not. She could be a refugee, but it's that ownership, that confidence, the education, and the belief in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you. Namita?
So if you look at how finance is stacked up to respond to any kind of requirements, it essentially starts with donor philanthropic capital. then comes subsidies by the government or sovereign interventions, if I may say. On top of that sits equity. Then comes the debt, if I may just put it in that order. In case of these kind of requirements, I think it's very important at this level to see how the market gets developed. Today, when we're sitting at the Climate Week here, there are so many conversations about multilateral development banks coming together, different platforms, private sector platform, sovereign platforms. I think there are two aspects that need to be looked at: the requirement and how do you then cater to that requirement, and what does that platform do? So, there are 10 multilateral MDBs who are coming together. IMF annual meetings announced that, and they're putting the platform together, and they're responding to different things: capital, technology, capacity building, so on and so forth. I think keeping the community at the core and the vulnerability at the core is very, very essential when we are looking at this whole ecosystem building, I would say. Thank you.
Namita, thank you. A quick vote of confidence. Are we getting your cash at the end of this? The thumbs model. I mean, everyone has a thumb. Come on, be brave. I'm not counting. You're not being filmed. We've moved the dial a little, but perhaps not enough. We'll have to come back next year and retake the conversation. Thank you very much for being with us today. Thanks for your participation and sharing your wisdom. And thank you.